South Australia as well, because we are co-hosts of this event. We welcome you all to today's lecture with Professor Andrekos Varnava. Today's lecture will be on the subject of Cypriot migration to Australia, and more specifically on the trip of the ship Corsica from Cyprus to Australia. And of course, Andrekos will talk to us about it more extensively. Η εκδήλωση σημερινή, αγαπητοί συμπάρικοι, πραγματοποιείται στα πλαίσια του φεστιβάλ Οδύσσια, που διοργανώνει κάθε χρόνο η Ελληνική Ορθόδοξη Κοινότητα Νότιας Αυστραλίας, και θεωρήσαμε σωστό στα πλαίσια αυτού του φεστιβάλ να διοργανώσουμε διάφορες εκδηλώσεις σε συνεργασία με άλλους αδελφούς οργανισμούς, όπως είναι η Κυπριακή Κοινότητα της Νότιας Αυστραλίας, και αργότερα θα έχουμε και με την Ικαριακή Αδελφότητα κάποια παρόμοια διάλεξη, ούτως ώστε οι εκδηλώσεις αυτές που προβάλλουν τον ελληνικό πολιτισμό, την κουλτούρα μας, τη γλώσσα μας, τη μουσική μας, την ιστορία μας, να τα μοιραζόμαστε όλοι πιο πλατιά και να μην γίνονται μέσα σε στενά περιορισμένα πλαίσια πάντοτε. Θέλω εκ μέρους των διοργανωτών, όπως είπαμε, της ελληνικής κοινότητας και της κυπριακής κοινότητας, να καλωσορίσω καταρχήν τον εκτελών χρέη Προέδρου της ελληνικής κοινότητας, τον Παναγιώτη Καρδιακό, που βρίσκεται εδώ πέρα, καθώς επίσης και τον Πρόεδρο της κυπριακής κοινότητας, τον Ανδρέα Ευδοκίου, τον οποίο και ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για την καλή του συνεργασία που δέχτηκαν να συνδιοργανώσουμε αυτή την ωραία εκδήλωση, που πιστεύω ότι θα είναι και πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα. Επίσης, θέλω να αναφέρω ότι στη σημερινή διάλεξη έχουν δηλώσει ότι θα παρευρεθούν και η Υπουργός Τεχνών, Καλών Τεχνών της Νότιας Αυστραλίας, η συμπατριώτησά μας Andrea Michaels MP, η οποία ίσως καθυστερήσει λίγο, θα έρθει όμως αργότερα. Επίσης, δήλωσε ότι θα παρευρεθεί ο κύριος Georganas, ομοσπονδιακός βουλευτής Αδελαΐδας, και η εντιμότατη Ειρήνη Πνευματικού, μέλος του Νομοθετικού Συμβουλίου της Νότιας Αυστραλίας. Πιστεύω οι άνθρωποι αυτοί έχουν και άλλες ασχολίες, θα έρθουν όμως με λίγη καθυστέρηση και θα είναι μαζί μας αργότερα. Ο Andrekos Varnava είναι καθηγητής ιστορίας, ειδικεύεται περισσότερο πάνω στην απικιοκρατική ιστορία της Βρετανίας στην Κύπρο, αλλά και στην μετανάστευση Κυπρίων προς Αυστραλία. Και πάνω σε αυτά θα μας μιλήσει. Έχει εκδώσει σειρά βιβλίων και κειμένων, τα οποία έχουν δημοσιευθεί. Ο Andrekos γεννήθηκε στη Μελβούρνη, δεν είναι πολύ μεγάλος σε ηλικία, όπως τον βλέπουμε, είναι του 79, και από Κύπριους γονείς, και οι δύο Κύπριοι πρόσφυγες γονείς. Σπούδασε εδώ, εργάστηκε στην Κύπρο, στο Ευρωπαϊκό Πανεπιστήμιο της Κύπρου για ένα διάστημα, και τώρα έχουμε την τύχη να τον έχουμε εδώ, να τον φιλοξενούμε στην Αδελαΐδα και να είναι καθηγητής του Πανεπιστημίου Flinders. Δεν έχω άλλα να πω, Andrekos, ευχαριστώ και σου παραδίδω το μικρόφωνο για τον λόγο.
Let me just start by saying that I acknowledge that the talk takes place on Ghana land, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Thank you to the two community groups who are co-hosting the event, particularly to Peter for taking the initiative. I also want to acknowledge the late great Bill Wanis, who was involved in those initial discussions, and his support has been appreciated, as is your support as well. And I was going to say welcome to the MPs, but since they're not here yet, I can't do that. So I'll get started, I suppose. Theo?
Yeah?
I can't seem to move there.
Technology.
Yeah, we got the screen up, but I can't move it onto my next slide.
Is the computer frozen?
Oh no, there's the mouse. I can see the mouse. Try the arrow. The mouse is there.
It's there. For some reason it just doesn't page down. I believe we have a remote control for the TV. Oh, it's there. That's what we want.
Or we could watch the game. What if we got out of
the HDMI?
No, I mean the screen and just played it the other.
After? That's what
Oh, he can't get out.
So for some reason
It's frozen.
Shut it down.
He's trying to escape that. He told me he was being too. It's already on.
Just end it and restart again. End it and restart.
There we go. So just the arrow? Oh, they take it down. Okay. Cool. Alright, so I want to start with this photo. It's of 6 men who were on the Corsica. The photo was given to me by my uncle the last time I saw him, just before he passed away, in Cyprus. The photo ended up in Cyprus. And he gave it to me because the person wanted me to have it, because my father was the gentleman sitting at the front with the white shirt. That's my father. And 2 of the other gentlemen were very well known to me. Just above my father, you can sort of see a little mustache, is Savas Antonio, who is a very significant Cypriot in Melbourne. He's been involved in the Cypriot community for many years and is still alive. And the gentleman standing on the right side, who's looking a little dapper with the hat and everything, that's Agustis Nicolau, who was very close friends with my father. So these relationships lasted until my father died, basically. And indeed, Savas Antonio, his plot is 2 plots away from my father's, completely coincidental. I don't know how that ended up happening. So today I want to talk about 3 things. The Cypriot emigration, which is distinct from migration, and I'll explain. So that's people leaving Cyprus, and then their destination specifically to Australia before 1952. And framing the voyage of the Corsica as part of one of these examples of horrible migrant voyages to Australia. The Corsica was one of these, and was one of the last one of these, and it was one of the worst. And then finally, at the very end, I'm going to show some statistics, because we have a lot of statistical data on the Corsica, which allows us to see their nationality, their ethnicity, sex, age, distribution, their civil situation, whether they were married or not, their occupations and skills, because the majority of them came on Form 47 forms, which they needed to declare that they had a skill, and where they were going, destination, and I'll show you a list of those on the Corsica who came to South Australia. There were 761 Cypriots on the Corsica. 761, there was nothing like it before or since. I just want to acknowledge that the project is part of an ARC grant that, well, the money is finished, but the project goes on. And these are some of the publications that have come out of the project so far. More publications are also coming out. You can see there that a lot of my work's on Britain. So basically I'm incorporating Australia and Britain and looking at cross-fertilisation between those two countries when it comes to border control and also migrant groups. So Cypriot emigration before 1945. So before 1912, it was quite small. Very few Cypriots migrated, especially to far-flung places. But Egypt and other parts of the Ottoman Empire were very popular. There was a very substantial community in Egypt, both in Cairo and in Alexandria. Between 1912 and 1916, we begin to see a movement of Cypriots to more far-flung places, the Americas and Western Europe. And this is stopped in November 1916 by the ban to recruit, by the ban because they wanted to recruit Cypriots for service in the First World War, which was the book, the green book that was on the table that we launched here about 4 years ago. So that put a stop to able-bodied men leaving the country. And once it restarted in 1920, we again begin to see Cypriots moving. However, very quickly the US, and by the way, it doesn't do this just to Cypriots, but it implements a policy of quotas across the board for its migration program. And this places, of course, limitations on how many can enter. And Cypriots were put into, if my memory serves me right, to a category under Asian, which was a very limited category. It was lifted a little bit later when they moved them to a different category, but very few Cypriots could go to the US in the 20s and 30s because of the restrictions. And then we begin to see Australia featuring in their sort of sites. In October of 27, because of the number of unemployed Cypriots in Australia, so we've already seen some coming, Canberra, the government, asked the Cypriot government to deny travel facilities unless applicants could carry £40 with them, which was a lot of money in those days. In November of 1928, 24 Cypriots arrived without the correct documents and insufficient funds, so they would be restricted, they said, like European aliens. And we need to remember here that Cypriots are not aliens by law, they were British. They had British passports from the time of World War I when Britain annexed Cyprus. Before that time, they did not have British documents, they did not have British passports, they could not be protected when overseas by British consulates. Some of them did though, but they weren't meant to. But by this point in time, they are British. So this becomes controversial. By 1933, those nominated, so you needed to be nominated by somebody in Australia. They needed to carry £50 with them, and those without guarantors had to have £200, which nobody did, really. And they, of course, must have a British passport, proof of sound health, and a police character reference, which they would get from Cyprus. In November of 1936, Cypriots and Maltese were now classified as white British subjects. So this was a fight that mainly the Maltese side took up. Needless to say, a lot more Maltese came to Australia, with Cypriots mainly moving to the UK. But their admission was subject to special consideration. So there's still restrictions. Now, Cypriot communities in Australia, until about 1945, were primarily working in catering. They owned cafes in those places that are listed there, some far-flung places up north, Queensland way, where the sugarcane was. We have Cypriot brotherhoods in Melbourne. The Xenon Club was established in 1932. In Sydney we had Varnavas established in 1933. We don't begin to see ideology taking over in these clubs until about 1945 with the earliest onset of the Cold War. Cypriots also joined the larger Greek clubs. The Democratus League in Melbourne was one example, which was established back in 1935, and the Atlas Club in Sydney, which was similar to the Democratus League, which was established in 1939. Now, percentage of Cypriot immigrants by country of destination. So this is a really interesting table with statistics. It basically just to explain that, it's showing us where Cypriots are going. It's showing us where Cypriots are going. So you can see here that between 1952 and 1965, the movement was primarily towards the UK, right? You know, there are some years there where there's 92, 93% going to the UK. Australia, however, is usually number 2 on the list. What the table doesn't show, you can see Greece is not really part of it. It would be, where it says non-available, it means it's in the other category. What's interesting here is that in 1951, Australia would have probably either been surpassed or at least equaled the movement to the UK. As we will see, 2,500 Cypriots left Cyprus in 1951. And then the other thing to say is, because I don't think I've got the slide, from 1971 to 1977, which is outside the scope of the talk, but during those years, Australia surpassed the UK for the first time and sustained that for all those years until 1977. Now, these are the census by birth. So obviously the census by birth, it's a limited type of analysis because it only tells us people who were born in certain countries. It doesn't tell us about their children and so forth. But you can see here in 1933 there were just over 500 Cypriots in Australia. Let me clarify. Cypriot born in Australia, sorry. And then in 1947 there were 681, so not really a significant change. But then we see in 1954 it's risen to 5,773, which is a massive spike. And then we can see that it plateaus. It grows to 8,500 by 1961, and the majority of those people, at least half of them, would be women coming over and children, and then very small growth until 66. Again in 67, sorry, then again in 71, but then in 1976 there is a substantial jump. Because as I said before, from 1971, Cypriots begin to move to Australia in larger numbers, but of course that's further propelled by the events of 1974. So you can see here the two waves are between 47 and 54, but really up to 52, and then it's the other wave from 1971. Okay, so this is some limited statistics which I got from the Cypriot archives, and you can see the telling point here is that over 2,500 Cypriots left Cyprus in 1951, and this includes the 761 that were on the Corsica, right? So it's part of a very large movement. And then you can see the following year it's gone down to 356. Now I'll briefly talk about those restrictions. It stays down. In 1955 it goes up again. And you can think what's going on in 1955 in Cyprus. There are events in Cyprus which trigger people wanting to move, but then in 1956 we're back to restrictions. In fact, we're not just restrictions, they've stopped going to Cyprus to examine applications. And you can see again very small numbers moving between 57 and 59, but what you can also see correspondingly is the increasing number going to the UK. Very large numbers going to the UK during those years. And these are the Cypriot arrivals and net arrivals. So this takes into account the departures. Cypriots leaving Australia. Now there weren't that many. I think the next slide might show that. So you can see not many were leaving. But tellingly, interestingly, in 1952 the Gita Corsica arrived, has 144 leaving, which is the highest during that period. And you can see people also, there's a dip from 1955. People don't want to go back during the Orca period either. So that's an interesting statistic. Okay, so briefly, Australian immigration policies as regards the Cypriots. So leading up to the arrival of the Corsica. So in September 1946, a guy called Tasman Hayes, who was the secretary in the immigration department, he was the secretary for all through the 50s, I think. He said, although Cypriots are British subjects, they are racially akin to Southern Europeans and restricted as before, but without the need to carry the specific funds. So if you recall, I mentioned the £40 before they didn't have to carry that. The first half of 1948, we saw 1,500 applications from Cypriots on Form 47, which is the form where they have to have a skill. And the government at the time considered this to be excessive, so froze applications. They didn't know what to do, so they froze applications so they can examine the situation. This was lifted in 1949. They decided we'll lift it, but what we'll do is we'll cap applications. We won't assess more than 50 per month. So if there is a backlog, they'll just go into a queue. Then in April of 1949, the Immigration Minister Caldwell instructed that all approvals must be predominantly of European race, and those on Form 40. So Form 40 was the one where you had to have a sponsor. You didn't need to have a skill, you had to have a sponsor. Must be dependents of the sponsors. So that changes the ball game just there. You couldn't bring an older brother, for example. In May of 1951, now we're into a Liberal government, Form 47 applications were frozen again. And there are several reasons, I'm not going into all of them, but the main ones were the government was upset when in March a vessel arrived called the Protea, and there were Cypriots on the Protea. And some of them came without the correct papers, and some of them came with criminal records. And they were turned back, the ones with the criminal records. And then in August of 1951, Holt begins to restrict, Holt was the immigration minister for the Liberals, he begins to restrict Form 40 to dependents and Form 47 to those who were outstanding cases only. What's interesting about that is, and I'll show you the slide, the next one actually, the restrictions connected to the activities of Cypriot communists in the Communist Party of Australia and the links that they had with Agel back in Cyprus. So there's a lot of evidence for that. For another time, I have another paper that's finished on that subject. Now this is my father's application, and I think you can see here, standard application, very minimal information. He speaks a little English. He's going to Sydney, but that changed. He went to Melbourne. You can see his signature. I vouch for it. That's my father's signature. But what's very interesting is the date when it was approved. 23rd of May of 1951. So very, very, probably one of the last ones to be approved before Holt put those restrictions on Form 47 the following month. Now these restrictions, so I'll get to the Corsica, but in January of 52 the Corsica has arrived in Fremantle. Now what happens in January of 52 in terms of immigration policies is that selection, so before 1952, migration officers from Egypt, as part of the consulate, would go to Cyprus to vet people, or sometimes they wouldn't go at all, the applications would just go to Egypt and they would approve them or not. But in 1952, as part of the Australian Greek Assisted Passage Scheme, migration officers in Athens would come to Cyprus to look at all the applications. So this also changed everything. In July of 1952, H.G. Brooks, who was in the immigration department, described the new policy on migrants from the Mediterranean countries as, and I quote, drastic restrictions, especially for Cypriots. So needless to say, there was no assisted passage agreement with Cyprus. Now, that's not because Cyprus was a British colony, because Malta was one of the first places to have an assisted passage agreement. In fact, it was the first one after the UK. And then, of course, Greece, Italy, and so forth and so on, other countries as well, but Cyprus doesn't get one, never gets one. It is proposed by the Cypriot authorities, but the Australians don't want it. Now, the Cypriots were now limited to Form 40 applicants for dependents, right, of those guarantors, and Form 47 for those with skills in essential industries, and all of them were capped at 50 per month, and now they added another provision, irrespective of origin. So, as you may know, Egypt was in turmoil during the early 50s. Many Greek and Cypriot and so forth people were leaving, Maltese as well, were leaving Egypt, pretty much forcibly. And so there was a movement from these people to go to Australia, to go to other places. So that's why that was added, irrespective of origin. Okay, so horrible migrant voyages to Australia and the Corsica. So as I mentioned, the Corsica arrived in Melbourne in February of 1952, Fremantle the month before. There were 761 Cypriots on a dramatic voyage. The stench of the rotten potatoes, and there were also onions and other vegetables, was pretty bad. It was twice quarantined, little fresh or clean washing water, unsanitary conditions, there was food poisoning. When they got to Melbourne and the porters were, charged with taking their baggage off, they were given extra money when they complained because they began to become quite violently sick. So that's telling me something didn't go well. Now, there is a history of these horrible migrant voyages from 1946. There's a list of vessels there. Some of you might have relatives who came on those vessels or might have come on another vessel that was really bad as well, by the way. I'd love to know about it. These are the ones that I found. There were Cypriots on some of these vessels, and of course Greeks, Italian, Maltese. These vessels were very mixed, unlike the Corsica. The Corsica was an exception for that as well. But the Misra is very well known. The Derna is very well known. There's quite a lot of Jewish people on the Derna as well as the Misra. And the other point that I want to make is that the Liguria that you see there, that is actually the Corsica under another name. Okay, you get what I'm saying. So the Australian authorities actually knew the Corsica. It changed its name many times, as we will see. Now, commonly, these ships were reconditioned former troop ships from the war. The passengers complained about the facilities, the accommodation was too cramped. They mostly slept on the floor. The rooms and bathrooms were not cleaned by the crews. Water was dirty, smelly, or insufficient. Food was inedible. There was lots of stories of food poisoning. On one of these vessels, a child died. I think it was the Empire Brent. Family said it was due to food poisoning. Doctor said it wasn't. Who knows? Those associated with the vessel would blame the passengers, such as that, they would accuse them of lacking hygiene, that they had dirtied the floors and baths and toilets. Well, sorry, if it's blocked, what can you do? It's a very difficult situation. The government would express concerns, but did not accept responsibility because these ships were privately operated. Some liberals, who I would classify as anti-migration liberals, and other anti-immigrant members of the public, complained that these aliens would not fit into Australia, and they would say, look, the captain, they're saying it's their fault, their behaviour. So the Corsica. So let me start by going back to Cyprus, where I accessed the newspapers there. So some of you would know Louis Travel Agency. It still exists. Some of us would have travelled with Louis Travel Agency. Now Louis was responsible for the Corsica. On the 6th of November of 51, it advertised it as a 22,500 ton luxury liner. Let me pause there. It was a 7,500 ton vessel. Initially, the ship was built for the Kaiser in World War I. So it was meant to be a luxury ship for the Kaiser. It claimed that the crew and the food were Greek. It is true that some of the crew were Greek, but the food was primarily, I think, fair to say, classified as Italian. It had large lounge, dining and smoking areas, a musical band, a swimming pool, dance floor, hospital, bar, library, all of these things, as if they were travelling first class. None of those things, there was a swimming pool, but they used it to dump rubbish in. It wasn't something that could be used. Most of the time, the passengers just played cards. Now, on the 13th of November, Louis claimed that it was the best ship that they had ever offered Cypriots travelling to Australia, and was sure that they would send letters of thanks to them after their trip. Well, as soon as they got to Columbo, they began to send wires to their families saying, this is hell. And they did again when they got to Fremantle. Now, newspaper editors in Cyprus criticised the Cypriot colonial government for letting so many Cypriots leave. So they were arguing from the point of view of a sort of brain drain, or more of a labour drain, and for not monitoring the voyages to Australia. So they knew that the Italians and the Maltese had an officer on their vessels, or on vessels where there were substantial Maltese, to help out with their community on the ship. The Maltese actually had a commissioner in Australia who looked after new arrivals, or as best he could look after them, and he had people stationed in different cities in Australia. Now, at least 10,000 gathered to farewell the passengers, and the people slept in the streets. I forgot to say this was in Limassol. So they left from Limassol. And here we have a painting by the famous Michael Michaelides, who left Cyprus in 1955 and settled in the UK. He was a very famous painter. Some of you may have heard of him. And this painting was done before, obviously, he left to the UK. And now I know that it's dated 1950, but I also know that what those ships are. And they weren't in the harbour in 1950, all at once together, but they were there in December of 1951. So what happened was, after we went to the UK, he didn't show his artwork until 1959. He's probably gone to date it. Oh, he's got the date wrong, 1950 instead of 1951. This ship here is called the Ravello. That left Limassol on the 12th of December. The one in the middle there is the Corsica, and that left on the 13th. And the one on the far right is the Toscana. And probably this one leaving is the Hellenic Prince. So it was such an important event that he thought to paint it. But what's interesting is that he's focused on the people left behind, women and children. So this is a photo of the Marella, otherwise known as the Corsica. That was another name for the Corsica before it became Liguria. And this one is of the Liguria, which travelled in 1950. Very distinct vessel. And yes, the Ravello. The Ravello is the one that I said was left on the 12th of December. It had 300 Cypriots on it, I think. Now the Corsica arrived at Fremantle on the night of the 25th of January 1952. It was immediately recognised as the former Marella and Liguria. The Liguria also had a really bad trip. In fact, it went to court in Fremantle because of the issues that it had to get towed from out to sea. The stench was very significant. There was a list, or a tilt, if you like, on the vessel. So it was, people were sort of, maybe we should just keep on to one side. Passengers sent messages back home complaining of the conditions. Later on the 4th of February of 1952, it berthed at Station Pier in Melbourne. Soon the horror made headlines. So these are some of the headlines. Slum charge on migrant ship. 900 fight for water. A story of thirst, hunger and filth. Just one passenger I will talk about. Molly Mavris, who was a 21-year-old English woman travelling with her Cypriot husband Anthony and their 2 kids. She described the voyage, and I quote, "a hell trip on a floating slum. And we were treated like savages." So this type of language, this type of phraseology, we see in the previous voyages that I mentioned as well. The ship was cleaned 3 times on the voyage. So the ship went from Limassol to Egypt, and then it went to Djibouti. By that point in time, the potatoes and onions had rotted badly and it stunk. They had to clean it. Then they went to Columbo, where the cleaning job hadn't worked, and the ships continued to smell pretty badly, and they were forced to delay and to clean it. And then Fremantle, it was cleaned again. I should also say, by the time of Fremantle, the toilets are all blocked, the baths are blocked. There's rubbish everywhere, particularly in the swimming pool, which they used as a dump. Fresh water was dirty. Some said that it smelled of petrol. Other passengers, and the passengers had to buy water. What's really interesting is that one person I interviewed here from SA actually, told me that the water was bottled by the crew from a tap that was only allowed to be used by staff. That water was clean, and they bottled it and then sold it. Incredible. The wharfies, as I mentioned, were given additional pay after becoming sick from the filthy state of the ship. The captain was Greek. That's his name, Kostas. There's a photo of him in the newspapers. He blamed the Cypriots. I won't say the negative things that he said, but he blamed the Cypriots, just like the other captains and the other examples of horrible ships. Now, Harold Holt in Parliament was challenged by one of his own, who basically regurgitated what the captain said. And he said they couldn't do anything to stop these voyages. The migrants were all unassisted. They weren't assisted by us. In July of '52, the Greek-Australian communist, Georganas, many of you would know the name, delivered a petition to the Immigration Department signed by 268 unemployed Cypriots calling for a freeze on further immigration to Australia from Cyprus. And many of them, including my father who signed it, had been on the Corsica. So you can see here that they were struggling. Then the final point is that in February of 1954, the Louis Travel Agency, which had an office in Melbourne, sued one of the passengers. Actually, correction, he wasn't a passenger. His wife and children were passengers. He'd already come to Australia before. And he was sued because he didn't pay for their full fare. You know, they did this thing where you could postpone payment, and then after a while, you accrue interest. Anyway, he didn't pay for the full thing. He went to court. Now, the judge did a very interesting thing. He found for Louis, they won the case, but the money that he had to pay was very minimal in terms of the installments. So it was done over a number of years. And the judge said, this was a horrible ship. You were responsible. You did nothing. You've been doing this for a while, and it basically acknowledged the horror of the voyage. Okay. So, I think I'm doing okay for time since the last bit. Passengers. So now, there is a lot of statistics on this voyage. Not all voyages have statistics like this. Names, their skills, their age, well, obviously their sex, and so forth and so on. So, just to clarify, there were in total 863 passengers, 761 were Cypriots. The others were, as you can see here, some of them were Greek. Most of the Greeks were part of the crew. The British were primarily Maltese. Some of them were not Maltese, some of them were others. Stateless again, most of them were Greek, which is a very fascinating subject. And then the others are very small numbers. The Indian came from Columbo. He was a student coming to study at Melbourne University. Now, the breakdown of the 761, you can see there that the vast majority were Orthodox Greek Cypriot. What's interesting is that in the historiography on migration, very little has been written about Turkish Cypriots. In fact, actually I would say nothing has been written about them except for what they've written, what members of their community have written. So 7% is not an insignificant number. What we're seeing here is the nascent growth of that community, because those people who are going, when we see the addresses, they're all going to people who are Turkish Cypriots. And we can see here the sex distribution. There were 84% of the passengers were male, 16 or so % were female. I think that's to be expected. What's interesting, however, is that only 3 of the females were Muslim, which is very interesting. Again, what that tells me is that the men have only just begun to start coming to Australia, and there hasn't been that time for them to bring the women over. But what we're seeing in the Greek Cypriot community is that they have been there for longer, and they're bringing the women over, 122 females on the ship. This one's an interesting one, because I thought that here we would have a higher number of single people, but it fell on 61% were single. So almost 40% were married, which is quite interesting. And again, that there is an interesting split with the women again. Actually, more of them were single than married. Again, I would have thought that that would not be the case, but that ended up being the case. So there's a lot of women who are single coming over to try their luck. I'm fairly certain that fiancés would have been classified in the married category. And the age distribution is very interesting as well. So we can see here that the largest age group was between 20 and 24 years of age. That's probably to be expected at almost 33%, so almost a third. But the next highest group was 25 to 29. And followed that was 30 to 34, which ended up being higher than the age group 15 to 19, which I thought might have been higher. But we can see here, you know, there's even a substantial number at older than that as well coming over. The other interesting thing is that not one child was Muslim. So all the children coming over were Greek Cypriot, which is also interesting, and again goes to what I said before about the chronology, I suppose, of the establishment of the Greek Cypriot community in Australia before the Turkish Cypriot one. Now, this is where they declared on their documents that they were going. Oh, sorry, let me clarify. This is the manifest. Right, the list, not where they declared, because my father declared New South Wales, but on the manifest it does not say that, it says Victoria. So you can see the majority were going to Victoria and then New South Wales predominantly, so 88% were going there, but there is a still sizable group coming to SA as well. Now, their occupation, so as I said, they were mainly Form 47 people, applicants. So you can see here that farmer topped the list. Now, let me clarify. My father's papers said he was a farmer. He was not a farmer. He was not a skilled farmer. His parents were peasants. They grew potatoes and taro, what we would call taro gulugasi. He was not a farmer, really. He did odd jobs picking fruit, working at the, because his village was close to Varosi, close to Tambusta. He worked at the the port, the harbour, but nothing steady. But what else could he put? Farmer. He put farmer. Now, most of these people who put farmer were not skilled farmers, as we would understand, and indeed as the Australian authorities would understand, would be a skilled farmer. But what I find interesting is that there's quite a lot of other professions or skills that are listed there, which are quite interesting, from carpenter to mechanic to mason to tailor. Cypriots were famous as tailors, and many of them went to the UK and worked as tailors. And shoemakers. The gentleman in the photo, that I mentioned before, he was a shoemaker, and so forth and so on. And some quite interesting, 19 of them were clerks, which is quite interesting. Of course, the percentages are skewed by the fact that farmers were so predominant. Now, this is coming to the end now of the talk. I've just got a list here of people who were coming to South Australia. So these are the names. I'll leave it there for a minute and then I'll put another slide up. So these are the people who on the manifest had addresses to go to South Australia. Some of these people will be well known to some of you. Your name is on the list.
Yeah.
Kiriaki Tori.
Yeah, Kiriaki.
Yeah, is on the list there. She was 17 years old. She declared that she was a seamstress. I'm just trying to think. Your name's on the other slide. I'll show you the other slide in a minute. But some names that will be familiar to many people. I think. Too hard to read? Okay, we'll leave it up there once I'm finished.
George Mitsioki there?
Sorry?
George Mitsioki.
The surname?
George Mitsioki.
Mitsioki, yes, that name rings a bell. There it is, George Mitsioki. He was 21.
That's
and, yeah. Is that you?
No, my brother.
Oh, your brother, there you go. Oh yes, I think I saw that name. Yeah, there it is, the last one on the list. Yeah. He was 22 and a shoemaker.
Corsica, Italy, Saranda,
And yes, I'll show the next slide. And you can see here, so these are people who went elsewhere, but I know they came here. So your family, on the manifest, stated that they were going to Melbourne, I think, if my memory serves me right. But there you have the Agatangero family, Eleni, Panayotis, Yorgos, Marula, Andriano, Georganas. And this gentleman here, Vasilis Andreu, he's an Cypriot. He goes to the church that we go to. Yes.
Yeah.
And the other one is Andrekos Marinos, who I interviewed. I'm not sure if how he's going, but as you know, very prominent in the Cypriot and Greek, he passed away today. Yes, he's on the previous list. Yeah, I'll leave it up there. I'll leave it up there for you guys to look. These are the names, but you know what? There might have been many others who declared they were going to Melbourne or Sydney, and it was on the manifest, but came here eventually. Even my father came here for a couple of years, but he ended up going back to Melbourne. So, you know, people moved around quite a bit. There are many people who went to Melbourne and ended up here. Yes. We can open up now for Q&A. You can ask me questions in Greek. Yeah.
Can we please have a copy of that?
Oh, this year I can send you the list. If you email me, I can send you the list.
Secondly, from the 60% of the people who came from Corsica,
Yes.
do you know where they end up other than Adelaide? Any of them end up going to Orthodox?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I don't know. However, I'm just trying to look for a name. Pretty sure there was a lady here that was from my mother's village who went to Port Augusta. Port Pirie, sorry, Port Pirie. Nah, I've lost the name, can't find it. Oh, there, Pistola. So it wasn't the lady, she was one. Yeah, they went to Port Pirie, didn't they? Yes, they did. Yeah. All right, do we have any questions? Comments? Yep.
Roughly how long would the journey have taken?
So, to Melbourne? So it left on the 13th of December and it arrived on the 4th of February. So that's around 40 days? Over 40 days. Yeah. It arrived at Fremantle, I think, after 40 days. It was 25 and, yeah, it's 40 days they got to Fremantle. Yes?
You recently published an article that talked about Cypriots being undesirables from 1945 to about 1959.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, was that the Australian government or the UK government who
Both.
coined that term? And was the Australian government shifting from the White Australia policy when they relaxed the visa entry requirements? And was that because the Australian government wanted to build the infrastructure in Australia? So what happened? I'm interested if you could comment on that.
Well, both of them classified them as undesirable. They used different words to say the same thing, but they both classified them as undesirable. Just to give you an idea, in 1959, when the Australian government came up to renew the UK-Australian assisted passage scheme, the £10 POM scheme that we call colloquially, they made it very clear that they did not want Cypriots or Maltese to be able to come from the UK. And both the Maltese and Cypriot authorities said, yeah, but we have communities there that have been here for decades. Some of them have married English women. In fact, that was a criticism of the English authorities. So what do we do with people who have married English women? And the Australians just said, no, we don't want them to come over. What did you mean about the relaxation of the visa? When?
Was it in your article or was it might have been somewhere else?
Well,
When the government moved from away from the white Australia policy
Yes,
to more
but they don't really begin to do that until Whitlam comes to power, really. There's some signs earlier, but there's nothing really substantial going on. Basically, what I'm trying to show is that it isn't a linear, path towards the ending of white Australia. That the Labor government opened up Australia during the 40s, after the war, of course, and then from around 1951, when I began to speak about the restrictions on Cypriots, the Liberals began to pull back. But what's interesting is that the assisted passage agreements that we all are aware of, and Italians and Greeks, Maltese, there's this idea that they opened up Australia. No, each one of them had quotas that the Australian government could change from year to year. So some years the Maltese had decent numbers. The Maltese government always wanted more to be able to come. But the Australians always kept a check on how many could come. And the same applies for Greece and Italy and so forth and so on. So that was their way of controlling the numbers. And it wasn't until later on that we begin to see the White Australia policy being pared back. In the 60s, Australia does open up to what would have been classified as Asian countries. So I think it might be 67 or 66 when they begin to, they have an agreement with Turkey, for example. Yeah. Yes.
So what assistance do some of these people receive from the Australian government, if any, that is?
They received no assistance. They were completely unassisted. And that's because there was no agreement. There was no assisted passage agreement. So the Maltese, by comparison, the assisted passage agreement with the Maltese government, which was also, of course, British colonial government, they split the fare, £30 each, and the rest would be paid by the migrant. In the early years, it was only about £70 or £80 to come from Malta. It was a lot more to come from Cyprus, by the way, 120. The people on the Corsica paid 120, which was another criticism. Many pointed out, it cost that much to come from the UK. So there was no assistance from the government. Many of the addresses that you can see there, but especially when we look at the Melbourne and Sydney lists, they are the communities, they are the clubs. Right? So they would put the clubs down, and many people who, of course, were already here tended to live close to those clubs, right? Because that was community for them. So they received no assistance from the government. The only assistance, if I may, was something that Peter asked me about before. If my memory serves me right, in 1948 there was a series of flights that came to Darwin which contained Cypriots. These flights, they weren't like large, there was only about 20 or 30 on each plane, there weren't many. But they got into some difficulties when they got to Darwin. They were told, you stop here, there's no more travel, you stop here, make your own way to Melbourne or Sydney or wherever you want to go. And then the Cypriot community said, look, we'll make good. You get them to where they need to go, we'll make good. The problem was that they were still chasing the Cypriot community 3 or 4 years later, the one in Melbourne. I don't know if they ended up, I can't remember whether I went through all those files, but these were the things that, they helped them out then, but they wanted their money back, they wanted reimbursement. So there really wasn't any assistance. Yes?
How long was the trip? How long was the trip on the plane?
So on the plane,
On the boat?
on the boat,
So they leave Cyprus?
yeah, they left Cyprus on the 13th of December, and they arrived in Fremantle on the 25th of January, and then they arrived in Melbourne on the 4th of February. So it was 50 odd days all up, 40 odd days to get to Fremantle, but they were delayed about 10 days at Columbo. So in Columbo they were delayed, the ship had to be cleaned. Columbo is Sri Lanka, capital of Sri Lanka. And my father told me that he went out and with 2 others that he'd just met, and he got a tattoo of the Virgin Mary on his arm. And he went to the zoo twice, he must have liked it. So they got to go off the ship and experience those places. Same in Djibouti, they didn't stay that long there, but they did get off the ship. Yeah, east.
Do you have the manifest from Melbourne?
Oh yes, it's available online. It's from the National Archives. It's all digitised.
appears to be an over-representation of certain
Addresses?
areas of origin.
Yes.
Cyprus.
Yes, oh yes.
As opposed to the destination. So
Yes.
why is that the case? In other words, why so many from other people, I
Yes.
suppose, left their country and so many from Georganas, so their
Yes.
country at that particular time? What was so different?
Well, I don't know, I think the issue is that they are coming to SA because there are communities from Aravipur and Georganas already here. So I think that's why you're seeing a lot of names that are from Aravipur and Georganas here on the SA list. But when we take the whole list together, we don't see that necessarily. However, yeah, it's very interesting that in SA we have this phenomenon of, you know, probably more than 50% came from Aravipur, probably just under 50 came from Georganas, and the rest are sort of mixed. But I think it's because there were already communities here. So for example, with the flights that I mentioned in, I think it was 48, my wife's uncle, Andrekos Varnava, came on one of those flights. His cousin was already here from Georganas, so there was already people here from, and that's why they gravitated towards where people were. And this also explains why some of the other people, like Vasilis Andreu, left. I think he was meant to go to Melbourne, but he came here because there was already a very large community from Aravipur, and they hung out on the ship. You know, they hung out together on the ship. There was a very large number from Aravipur. Yes. You can ask me in
Αραβιώτες ερχόντουσαν εδώ, γιατί είχαμε περίπου 20 Αραβιώτες που they come here in the 20s.
20s, yeah.
Yeah, 19th.
So αυτοί έστειλαν προσκλήσεις στους συγγενείς του και ο ένας έφερνε τον άλλο.
Ναι, μπράβο.
I was surprised to see the statistics of the single women,
Yes.
which is low. I mean, you hear stories about parents providing photographs of their daughters to marry them off to people over here. Is this something that happened later, or was it before?
So what happened?
Those stories wrong.
So what happens is, usually, not always, but often the men would come here first if they were married, and then after a few years they would bring their women. There are of course stories where they didn't bring their women over, but we won't talk about that for a minute. But those who did worked here for a few years and brought their women over, and in some cases their children. This is an example. You're an example of that because you just came with your mother, right, and your brothers and sisters. Yeah, your father was already in Australia. So what happens is that after 1952, they begin to, as I said, restrict, but they don't restrict women coming over. So it's after the first lot come out in 47, 48, 49, 50, and 51, we then begin to see, I should have had that slide, the statistics which shows the women arriving really increasing in number from 1954, 5, 6, 7, 8. They really increase in number. Yeah, sorry I didn't have that slide. But yes, that is the reason. They would inevitably wait a couple of years to save up. You can understand £120 is a lot of money. The court case that I mentioned in 1954, the poor guy being sued by Louis travel agents, is an example of that. The guy couldn't pay. And in 1952-53, there was an unemployment crisis in Australia, actually, which also explains the numbers that I showed you before on the other slide with 144 leaving that year in 1952. Any other questions? Yes?
You specifically look at the Corsica. Were there other ships though coming as well, or was it just...
Oh yes, there were other ships coming.
At that time.
But the difference is that this one basically only contained Cypriots, whereas the other ships contained a mixture of groups from Malta, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, Lebanon, Egypt. This was the only one that wasn't like that just contained Cypriots. So some of the other vessels that I mentioned, so the Ravello that left on the day before, that had 300 odd Cypriots on it. That's why the newspapers said, 1,000 Cypriots are leaving in this one sort of tranche. But there were other vessels as well, the ones I mentioned before, like the Mizra, the Protea, the Hellenic Prince, but they did not have anywhere near this many Cypriots on them. Yeah. There were some ships that might have just had 10 Cypriots on them. Some Cypriots went to Egypt to catch the ship.
Yes.
Right? So in those instances, there would have been, in some cases, just 2 or 3, or maybe up to half a dozen families that would go that way. Later on, we begin to see them going to Greece. Because in 1956, they also stopped, the Australians stopped sending their migration officers from Athens to Cyprus because of the troubles in Cyprus. So some people, especially women, they went to Athens to be assessed. Yes?